Hello, everyone. So, we are going to talk about Zootopia 2. So, this is the 64th film in the Disney animated features canon, and it's, of course, the sequel to Zootopia from 2016. It was directed by Jared Bush and Byron Howard, these people over here, who worked on the first Zootopia. And this movie is a big deal, apparently, based on just how well it did, critically and commercially. It made over $1 billion. It surpassed Frozen as Disney's highest grossing animated film. It is the second highest grossing animated film of all time. And it seems to be a big deal. So, why is it such a big deal? Well, I think it all goes back to the first movie, which was an allegory for racism, and I think that resonated with a lot of people. And I think this one also resonates with people because it's all about this group of outcasts, the reptiles, and, who doesn't feel like an outcast at some point in their life, for whatever reason. So whereas the first movie is about racism and how predator animals and prey animals don't get along because predator animals are stigmatized, this movie seems to be more about ableism because it focuses on the reptiles whose cold-bloodedness prevents them from participating in the society of Zootopia. So, I think it definitely is an allegory for ableism in society, whereas the first was an allegory for racism. So, let's dive into it because, of course, disability is what we're writing about in the essay, and how the movie depicts disability, and whether that is a positive or negative depiction. So let's see how disability is handled in this movie. But before we dive into Zootopia 2, I thought it would be helpful if we got some context. And specifically, I wanted to talk about Disney and disability because this is a Disney movie. Disney, as I'm sure y'all know, because I actually referenced some Disney movies when we were talking about disability theory in a prior class period. They, as a company, as a studio, have included several disabled characters in their movies going back to the early days with characters like Dumbo. And then, of course, with Pixar, you have famous characters like Nemo. And they have a lot of disabled characters who are heroes and do heroic things. And then they also, and their disability is just, a part of them and doesn't hold them back or anything. And then we have other characters who are villains, like Lotso is who I chose for the slide. For example, he has a cane. And that sort of is shorthand for him being evil. That's a case of narrative prosthesis, which we talked about. We also have people like Captain Hook, another example of narrative prosthesis, because his hook represents his evilness. And then there's a third category of disabled Disney character, which would be those who are never identified as disabled, but probably are based on several clues. I taught Elio last semester for this assignment. Elio seems to be autistic, but he's never identified as such, and you have to wonder why. So he's a disability-coded character, and then we have token disabled characters in other recent movies like Wish. Here we have Asha's friend, Dahlia, and she has her crutch here, but she isn't really a prominent character in that movie if you've seen it. It's just like she was thrown in there to meet some sort of diversity quota. I struggled to even remember her name to look her up for the slide. So as you can see, sometimes they just throw characters in there with disabilities for the sake of diversity without actually doing anything interesting or worthwhile with those characters. So they've come under criticism for that. So Disney has a long history with depicting disability. Sometimes they do it well, sometimes not so well. And we'll see how they do with Zootopia 2. So the first thing to note is Zootopia 2 has lots of symbols that I think are significant to what its message is about disability. I think the most prominent one is the weather walls, and the weather walls are the public accommodations that allow all the animals to live together. They honestly seem like a representation of public accommodations in real life to make public spaces accessible for disabled people, like wheelchair ramps or menus with braille or what have you. The weather walls help animals with different body types and different needs thrive in Zootopia, except for the reptiles, who are ostracized. Then we have the carrot pin, which I think symbolizes on one level Nick and Judy's relationship, but I think in this film in particular, it symbolizes rather Nick's trauma, which I want to talk about as a disability, because PTSD, which I argue Nick seems to have, or at least trauma, that can be disabling, and because he struggles to cope with his trauma, his relationship with Judy is strained because he sort of adopts a cynical, you could say, outlook on life, on the world, and societal injustice, and how it can't be fixed because that's just the way it is. And then the pen breaks when he's arguing with Judy about this, and that shows the strain between them because of his difficulty with overcoming his trauma. And then we have the Linksley Journal, the supposed Linksley Journal, more like the DeSnake Journal, if you know what I'm saying. But anyway, the journal, of course, it has its metal cover, and the metal cover contains the secret of what happened to the reptile neighborhood. And the fact that only a pit viper can read it shows that individuals who are labeled as disabled for whatever reason, oftentimes in real life, and certainly in this movie, have super abilities, or rather they have capabilities that a prejudiced society might not expect them to have. In this case, Gary is able to see through the metal cover because he has heat sensing organs, and therefore he can undo all the injustice that was wrought by the Linksleys to ostracize the reptiles. And probably the most obscure example is the Liebenflower, which are the flowers on that mountain that grow around the Honeymoon Lodge. And the Honeymoon Lodge was a reptile hideout, and the flower appears on that matchbox that helps Gary read what's underneath the cover on the journal. So I think the flowers also represent how people who are disabled are often underestimated And we also have those mountain goats whose environment has a lot of those flowers. And the mountain goats, even though they have a cane and a walker, they're able to scale up the mountain. So I think that also goes along with the whole idea of disabilities largely being societal constructs. Alright, so let's talk about Nick first of all, because I was talking about him earlier. So he is a character who I would argue does have a disability in the form of trauma, which he struggles to cope with. He tells inappropriate jokes, like saying that tortoise's death must have been a slow death, which is totally, not very sensitive. And if you know anything about the first Zootopia, it's that he was stereotyped as a kid because he was a fox, and foxes were considered untrustworthy and sneaky and sly and violent as a predator, so he was muzzled by some bullies as a kid. So that's where his trauma comes from. It is interesting that he says he has an aversion to reptiles, even though in theory he should be able to relate to them because he has had experience with prejudice himself. So I think that just goes to show that in the real world it can be hard for people, even if they have a similar experience, to overcome their bias, And also, I would say that his trauma prevents him from wanting to make the world a better place. So that is his arc, where he goes from being cynical and joking about serious matters to actually caring about serious matters, like helping the reptiles. Speaking of the reptiles, I wanted to talk about them as a group, first of all, before we dive into individual characters. I think the most obvious disability they have is they're all cold-blooded, and that puts them at odds with the warm-blooded mammals. So their cold-bloodedness is obviously just a socially constructed disability implemented by mammal-dominant society, specifically the Lynxleys, who are an influential, rich family who control the city's mayor, and even picked the mayor, they said. So, Zootopian society under the Lynxleys does not accommodate cold-bloodedness because they just keep expanding Tundra Town and therefore push the reptiles out because they can't live in a cold environment. And they also manipulate the weather walls to where the weather walls won't help the reptiles. And then we have other markers in the movie that show that they're meant to be disabled characters, or rather I should say representations of real disabled people. I thought it was interesting that we get our first glimpse into the reptile hideout, the lizard lounge, from a tortoise who moves out of the way to show the reptile world, and he is wearing an eye patch, which I'm tempted to say doesn't seem to be incidental. So we have quite literally someone with a disability, blindness in one eye, and we also have the fact that the reptiles lose limbs or don't have limbs if they're snakes, which I think might make them analogous to amputees in real life. And also, I thought it was interesting that they get stigmatized for being venomous, some of them at least, which seemed to be analogous to people with certain diseases like HIV or AIDS, which is considered a disability, and which, especially when it first emerged, had a lot of stigma around it. So I thought that was an interesting parallel. So now that we've talked about the reptiles in general as representing people with disabilities, let's talk about specific characters who are reptiles. And I wanted to start with Jesus, whom I think is notable. He is a prominent member of the Marsh Markets reptile community, obviously. And I thought it was interesting how he reclines on these branches, which he has in his little room at the Lizard Lounge. So I thought it was interesting how his little environment sort of is made for him, and how Nick and Judy, Nick especially, struggle with fitting into, or rather finding a way to sit in these chairs, whereas Nibbles, she easily adapts, and put a pin on that. We're going to talk about her in detail later. But anyway, he wants mammals to see that reptiles ain't that different. That's an exact quote, which I think is one of the film's most important quotes. But yes, his domain is made for reptiles like him, and his allies are able to adapt or try to understand the reptile way of life, because, as he says, reptiles and mammals aren't so different. And even though the mammal-dominant society would label him as disabled for his cold-bloodedness, he does have a super ability, in that he can run on water. That's why his name is Jesus. Get it? But anyway, that just goes to show that disabilities often can be socially constructed, because this allegedly disabled person, lizard person, is actually quite extraordinary in what he can do. And that applies to several characters, like Gary, I think one of our main characters and one of the film's prime examples. So his backstory is he lost his home, the reptile neighborhood, because of the Lynxleys, like all the other reptiles. And it just so happens that his great-grandmother is the one who founded Zootopia and created the weather walls. So he's out to clear the reptiles' name. Like the other reptiles, he is cold-blooded, which makes him quote-unquote disabled in Zootopian society. And not only that, but he is venomous and therefore stereotyped as dangerous, even though he has his own anti-venom pen, which I thought was kind of similar to people with allergies and how they have EpiPens. So make of that what you will. But like Jesus, he has a super ability, several super abilities in fact. He is heat sensing, and that gives him the ability to see what is hidden in the cover of the journal. And he also can hold his breath for extended periods, if you remember that scene where he successfully swims away from Nick and Judy in the water tube. So, in other words, this person, Snake, who is considered disabled by the oppressive society in which he lives, actually is capable of a lot, even more things than the mammals who oppress him even. But not all mammals are bad. And a prime example of that is Nibbles. So Nibbles is a reptile expert. She's actually called that in the movie, and she is an ally to the reptiles. She is a lesser mammal, according to Milton Linksley. So Milton Linksley calls the water folk, or the mammals who live in watery habitats like Marsh Market. He calls them lesser. And I could see those mammals as being representative of disabled people in real life as well, because they can't function, if they stray too far from the water. I think there's even a dolphin at Marsh Market, and of course you can't put a dolphin out of the water. So they are limited, and in that way they can relate to the reptiles, who are also limited because of their cold-bloodedness. And like the reptiles, they are shunned by society, perhaps not to the same degree as the reptiles, but still, she bonds with the reptiles because she gets what it's like to be ostracized, stigmatized, or what have you. And as you can see, they have their own little culture at the Marsh Market that other mammals from Zootopia, like Nick, don't understand. There's that sea lion, for example, who is a juggler, whom Nick gives a tip, but he gives a coin instead of a fish, and he doesn't understand the culture. So I think that sort of is the cultural model of disability, where people who have disabilities form their own cultural norms and institutions or what have you. And the last thing to say about Nibbles is that she, despite being ostensibly disabled, has a super ability, wood carving, with her teeth. And I think that also ties in with the whole theme of accommodations in public spaces. She literally alters the environment to make things better for people she cares about. And to help herself fit in. So, and she does make that key to bust herself and Nick out of jail. So she definitely is an ally to the reptiles because she alters her environment for the greater good. And there were a few others in there, like the mole named Paul. So he is a citizen of Zootopia. He's part of the police, and he still has a hard time because he's so small. He sometimes gets knocked around because of his size. And then there is another mammal who lives in Zootopia, Flash, who is stereotyped as being slow, when actually he can be quite fast. So people like these, I think, just illustrate that not every society is perfect, obviously. And sometimes societies that would seem to prop you up actually can fail you. Because Flash and Paul are part of Zootopia. They are not lesser mammals. They're totally land mammals. But, still, they have problems. So that just goes to show that there's always room for improvement to make everyone feel welcome, regardless of their body type, limitations, or what have you. My final thought, Zootopia 2 is a very disability positive film in my opinion. I think it definitely argues in favor of the social model. And it also touches on the cultural model with the relationship between the reptiles and the water mammals, and how they form their own little culture apart from the society that rejects them. And I think it also is significant to say that the film definitely is not literal in its discussion of these matters. It definitely is allegorical, and I think that has pros and cons, because it makes this topic, accessible when you're not addressing it directly. And on the flip side, it also begs the question of whether this topic of disability access in society is something that needs to be depicted literally because it is so important. But hey, this is Zootopia, and the franchise is known for dealing with social problems through allegory. And if you stuck for the post-credit scene, you saw that a feather comes down on Judy's windowsill, and I think that just goes to show that we're going to see some more forms of prejudice confronted in the Zootopia franchise. I wonder what the birds will face in terms of injustice. I guess we'll just have to see. But anyway, thanks you guys. I hope these thoughts that I gave on the movie gave you some guidance with the paper, and I will see y'all next time. Thanks, guys.
Please comment the answers to or email me the answers to the following questions. 1. What is one parallel between the reptiles and disabled people in real life? 2. The reptiles are disabled because Zootopia does not accommodate their cold-bloodedness. This is an example of which model of disability? 3. The water mammals and reptiles, both limited in ways the land mammals are not, form their own culture. This is an example of which model of disability?